I can still taste the chill of that evening air, the way it seeped through the cracks of the old porch boards as I sat here on this creaky rocker, sipping what was left of my coffee long gone cold. You can almost hear the cicadas out beyond the pines, humming a lullaby I hadn't heard in decades, and it's in that hum that it all comes rushing back, like a photograph sliding out of an old shoebox. I'm just an old man now, 66 years aged by life's turns and twists, with 5 grandchildren who think my stories belong to bedtime fairy tales. But tonight I'm talking straight to you, friend, because this memory's been gnawing at me all day. It's late, maybe 8 o'clock, but time in my mind drifts back to '64, to a little village in eastern Ukraine, where I was just a scrawny 5-year-old boy with more questions than answers. Back then, my father was nothing but a name whispered among neighbors, killed on some faraway construction site before I ever drew my first breath, and my mother, well, she wasn't herself anymore. The vodka bottle loomed larger than anything else in our humble home, and the windowsill where I used to watch the sunrise became my only anchor. I remember the tremble in her hands when she handed me off to that neighbor, old Nikolai, like I was some broken thing nobody wanted. And oh, how that thought stings my chest even now. You know, if this story is tugging at your heartstrings, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd give that like button a gentle tap, leave a note down in the comments, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing. There's more to come, and I reckon it might do you some good, too. There, just a little grandfatherly nudge, 5 seconds of your time, and we'll get right back to it. Because you see, I didn't understand what was happening then. I thought I'd been sent off like a stray dog, left out in someone else's yard for safekeeping. I had no clue that my mother, the only family I had traded me for a bottle of something she couldn't live without. The sky that night was the same shade of amber as that bottle's contents, and every memory after that felt stained by its glare. But tonight, living here in Texas, where the trains still whistle in the distance just like they did in my youth, I'm piecing together what it meant to survive such an exchange. I'm older now, with a wife of 42 years and a house full of laughter, but that 5-year-old boy never truly left me. He's the one who taught me what it means to find forgiveness where there seems to be none, to chase down the family who took me in, and to keep a heart open even when the world had every reason to close it tight. So stick around, friend, there's more to this tale, and if you're willing to lean in, I promise it'll be worth your while. Because sometimes survival isn't about the grand victories, it's about holding on to the little sparks of kindness that light your way back home. I remember the summer sun filtering through the cracks in our little wooden cottage, the beams of light dancing on the dust motes as if they were tiny fireflies. Back then, I was just a curious 5-year-old boy with big dreams and an even bigger heart, living in that sleepy village in eastern Ukraine where everyone knew your name and the rhythm of life was set by the church bell and the whistle of the wind through the wheat fields. Mornings smelled of fresh earth and dew-kissed hay, and you could hear the roosters crow before dawn, calling us out of our dreams and into another day of simple chores and simpler joys. My world was small, just a handful of dirt roads, our cottage painted in faded blue, and the wide open sky that seemed to stretch on forever. My mother, though often quiet these days, would braid my hair and tuck me into her arms as if I were the last good thing in her life, whispering that kindness was the finest treasure and that people always found their way back to you. I believed her wholeheartedly. I believed back then that a warm smile could mend any wound and that generosity was life's greatest currency. In the afternoons, I'd wander off to the edge of the fields, pressing my palms against the tall grasses, listening for the distant clip-clop of horses pulling carts laden with grain. The other children and I would play hide-and-seek among the sunflowers, our laughter echoing against the wooden fences and making our mothers shake their heads fondly. We shared stories of far-off places, Americans coming to build mighty railroads, heroes with steam engines that roared like thunder across continents, and I'd close my eyes and imagine myself at the helm of one of those iron beasts, puffing black smoke into the sky as I carried passengers to new beginnings. My dreams were as wild as the clouds above me, and I trusted that the world would unfold just right, that good people would always keep their promises. Evenings were my favorite. The fireflies would flicker in the tall grasses, and my mother would hum lullabies, her voice soft as a breeze. I'd sit on her lap, tracing the lines of her weathered hands, thinking about tomorrow, tomorrow's adventures, tomorrow's surprises, tomorrow's kindnesses. I felt safe, grounded by the steady heartbeat of that village and the gentle sway of the hammock strung between two birch trees. I believed then that this sense of home, this feeling of belonging, would last forever. I didn't yet know that life could turn sharp corners, that a bottle of vodka could eclipse all the promises whispered in the dark. I didn't yet understand that sometimes even the people who love you most can be lost to their own sorrow, their own battles, leaving you to fend for yourself in a world that suddenly feels too big and too cruel. But in those days, I carried hope in my pocket like a lucky coin, convinced that kindness would follow me wherever I went, and that if someone ever walked away, they'd find their way back with flowers and apologies and stories of regret. I was a child who believed in miracles, in the goodness of strangers, and in the unbreakable bond of family. And though the winds of time would soon blow that innocence away, I hold on to those memories of golden afternoons in the promise of a mother's hug, because they remind me that, even when life turns bitter, the sweetness of hope is never entirely lost. I'll never forget the morning it happened, the way the light peeked through our cottage window and danced on the wooden floorboards, as if it were trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I was 6 years old, still clutching my ragged teddy bear, when I first laid eyes on him, Nikolai, the neighbor whom everyone whispered about at the market and in hushed tones by the well. My mother had sent me to fetch water, and there he was, standing in our yard like a stranger dropped from the sky, a half-empty bottle of vodka tucked under his arm. I remember the flutter in my chest, like a bird trapped in a jar, because I'd only ever seen a bottle like that once before, on the mantel in our little kitchen, and it always meant tears and shouting and doors slamming. But this time, it was different. Nikolai didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He just looked at me with eyes that were neither kind nor cruel, just tired. I couldn't rightly explain why my heart skipped a beat, but I felt it then, clear as the morning sun on my face. In the briefest moment, I caught myself wanting to run back inside, back to where I felt safe with my mother's soft hum and the smell of fresh-baked bread, and yet, something in me held me there, rooted to the spot like a sunflower turning to catch the dawn. My mother appeared then, her braid undone and her eyes red, and she didn't smile. Instead, she sauntered over to Nikolai and took that bottle from him as though it were the heaviest gift she'd ever received. I watched her hands shake, and I thought of how she used to cradle me, how she used to whisper that kindness was our greatest strength. But I saw no kindness that morning, only desperation, a heavy cloak she no longer had the strength to shrug off. Nikolai spoke then, his voice low and gravel rough, and I remember straining to catch every word, though all I heard was the rumble of my own heartbeat. He offered her bread, he offered her work, he offered her a promise that my life would be different if she'd just let him take me in for a while. My mother nodded, almost imperceptibly, and I felt my stomach twist into knots as if it were trying to climb up into my throat. It happened so quietly, no raised voices, no tears falling to the ground, just a man extending his hand and a woman nodding as though she were caught in a dream she couldn't wake from. I stared at them, bewildered, wondering if this was some strange game or a lesson I'd missed the first 5 years of my life. My first thought was, maybe I'm going on an adventure, because that's what children do. They find wonder even in the darkest places. But before I could gather the courage to swing my legs off the well's edge, Nikolai offered me his hand. His palm was rough, calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, and I felt a strange comfort in its solidity. I took it, reluctantly, and in that moment, something inside me shifted irrevocably. I felt like a train leaving the station, headed somewhere I didn't want to go, but unable to turn back. As we walked down that dirt road together, I glanced once at our cottage, at the small window where my mother stood, her silhouette framed by morning light, and I realized I was being handed off like a parcel. The world I thought I knew, filled with lullabies and laughter and promises, slipped through my fingers in that single walk. And yet, even as fear tightened its grip around my heart, a tiny spark of curiosity flickered. What lay beyond the fields of wheat? Who was this man who didn't hurt me, who didn't yell, who simply took my hand and led me away? It was the first push down the track of my life's greatest journey, a path marked by loss and longing, but also by an unexpected grace I hadn't yet understood. It was the moment when the story changed course, when the boy who believed in kindness was tested in a way he'd never imagined, and when I first learned that survival sometimes comes disguised as something you never saw coming. I woke up that first morning under Nikolai's roof to the smell of stale smoke and the dull clang of a metal bucket hitting the well's lip, and in that moment I realized I was truly alone. The sky outside his kitchen window was a pale gray, and the only warmth came from the whisper-thin blanket tucked around my shoulders. I wasn't a guest, I was something owed, a debt negotiated in vodka and silence, and the weight of that truth pressed down on me before my feet even touched the cold wooden floor. Nikolai didn't greet me with the gentle hum my mother used to, the hum that felt like a promise. He simply handed me a chip spoon and pointed to a bowl of watery porridge, letting the clatter of metal on would speak for him. I remember the porridge tasted of nothing, like my old life had been boiled away and replaced by emptiness. As I spooned each bite, I felt the first stirring of anger, that old shield I'd never dared raise against my mother, because here I was, hungry and trembling, in a house that smelled of loneliness and regret. Outside, the wind shook the shutters, and I imagined my mother somewhere beyond that gray sky, perhaps lost in a fog of her own making, wondering what had become of me. But I had no words to call her, no safe corner in which to hide my tears. The other children in the village quickly learned I wasn't one of them. They eyed me with curiosity and pity as I walked the dirt road to fetch water each morning, my small hands gripping the bucket's handle too tightly, my shoulders hunched against the hollow ache in my chest. Their mothers whispered behind gnarled hands, voices rising and falling like the wind. "That boy's been sold for a drink," they said. "Her child." Their pity cut deeper than any scolding. It marked me as broken, someone whose story was already written in the shaking of my belly. Nikolai expected me to work, hauling wood, fetching water, tending his garden, chores I had never imagined doing at 5 years old. Each task felt like a trial by fire. My palms burned from the rough bark of splintered logs, my legs trembled from climbing the narrow ladder to scrape moss off the roof. My back ached from stooping to plant seeds in soil heavier than any bed I'd slept in. And through it all, Nikolai's eyes watched me, unmoving, unreadable, like a judge weighing every ounce of effort. There was no gentle word, no smile of encouragement, only the unspoken law that I belonged here now, that I would earn my keep or be sent elsewhere to earn it. Every night, I lay in that shack beside the barn, the thin wooden walls rattling with the hoot of owls, and I felt the raw knot of fear tighten in my throat. I missed my mother's lullabies, the way her voice rose and fell like a cradle rocking me toward dreams. I missed the little field by our cottage where the daisies brushed my knees and promise seemed as certain as sunrise. In this place, promise was a stranger, slipping through my fingers like sand. Inside me, conflicting emotions warred, shame that I could not be the son my mother deserved, terror that I would never see her again, anger that she let this happen, and a deep loneliness that made each breath feel like the first after drowning. I wanted to run, to sprint until the earth swallowed me up, but my legs refused to obey. Instead, I stooped to the work, my small frame bending under the weight of logs, and I learned that survival meant swallowing my pride. Yet every ache in my back, every cold shiver in my bones, carved a new question inside me. Was I meant to endure this hardship for the rest of my life? Should I fold myself into resignation, accept that kindness was a myth, or should I hold on to the tiny spark of hope my mother once lit within me? That question hovered in the air each morning as I filled the bucket by the well, and I realized my greatest battle was not against Nikolai's chores or the villagers' whispers, but against the fear that perhaps my childhood, my very right to belong, had been traded away forever. I remember the day everything changed as if it were etched in my bones, that moment when the world tilted on its axis and I found myself standing at the edge of a life I no longer recognized. It was spring, the air smelling faintly of blooming lilacs and freshly plowed earth, but inside Nikolai's barn, the scent was heavy with dust and regret. I had spent the morning stacking firewood, my small hands raw and blistered, when I heard the distant roar of a truck engine and the clatter of boots on the wooden threshold. I paused, mid-stack, my heart thudding in my chest, because something in the way the dust motes swirled told me this was no ordinary visitor. Then the door swung open with a crack that echoed like a gunshot, and 2 men in dark uniforms stepped inside, their faces hidden beneath the brims of stiff caps. I swear, in that instant, the whole world went silent. Every creak of the barn floor, every whisper of wine through the slats, everything stopped dead in its tracks. I remember how I froze, the axe handle still in my grip, the weight of it a cold anchor in my hands, and I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my small body tremble as the men's eyes found me in the half-light. One of them barked a question, something about theft, about suspicion, and I saw Nikolai step forward, his broad frame filling the doorway, shoulders squared though I could see the shake in his hands. He tried to speak, to explain, but his words came out in a strangled whisper, and the men cut him off, slapping cuffs on his wrist with a final clang that sent a shock through my chest. I remember how, at that moment, I felt the hands of time loosen their grip, as if the clock itself had stopped, its pendulum frozen mid-swing, its minute hand quivering above the 12. I stood there, axe forgotten, watching as they forced Nikolai into the truck, the sunlight catching the tears on his weathered cheeks. I cried out, a hollow sound that echoed through the barn rafters, but no one answered me. The truck door slammed, its metal slam a punctuation mark on my childhood, and then the engine roared back to life, and they were gone, leaving me alone with the echoes of their departure and the ragged ache of loss. In the following moments, I felt a fracture open inside me, as if the part of my heart that trusted in safety and belonging had shattered into a million pieces. I realized I was utterly alone, a 5-year-old boy caught between the world I'd known and the unknown that yawned before me. I dropped the axe handle, its weight clattering to the floor like the last note of a mournful song, and I sank to my knees, arms wrapping around my chest as though I could hold my heart together by sheer force of will. The barn faded into darkness, and I could only feel the sting of tears burning my cheeks, the bitter taste of abandonment settling on my tongue. In that moment, I lost more than a guardian. I lost the fragile belief that kindness would see me through. I lost the sense of home, the certainty that someone would always be there to catch me if I fell. And yet, even as the panic clawed at my stomach and the loneliness enveloped me like a shroud, a small, stubborn ember flickered deep inside my chest. It was a spark of something I couldn't name, maybe hope, maybe defiance, whispering that I would not break, that I would endure, that this was but one chapter in a story still waiting to be told. But I couldn't feel that spark yet, not when the weight of the world pressed down on my shoulders and the barn seemed to close in around me. All I could do was weep for the boy I once was, for the man I thought I'd become, and for the life that lay in pieces at my feet, waiting for me to gather up the fragments and find a way forward. And so I stayed there, on those cold wooden planks, until my tears dried and the last shaft of sunlight slipped through the crack in the door, reminding me that day would soon turn to night, and that, whether I was ready or not, I had to stand up and face the darkness ahead. I spent the days that followed in a kind of hollow hush, as if the world itself had exhaled and held its breath, waiting to see if I would shatter completely or somehow find a way to carry on. The barn door, once so solid, felt like a gaping maw behind me, and every creak in the rafters echoed the loneliness that settled in my bones. I dragged myself through chores as if moving through water, hauling buckets of water from the well, stacking wood for fires I scarcely felt the need to light, and wandering the fields at dusk, tracing the silhouettes of wheat stalks against a copper sky as though searching for a trace of the boy I used to be. In those first weeks, I barely spoke. My voice felt foreign in my throat, and I feared that if I tried to call out for my mother, my words would crumble into dust before they reached her. I learned quickly that silence could be both shield and cage. Neighbors would toss sympathetic glances my way, their eyes full of pity, but I couldn't bring myself to meet them. Their concern felt like another weight pressing down on me. Inside, I carried a question I couldn't answer. How do you rebuild faith in people when the very ones meant to protect you have let you go? Slowly, I discovered that the routines I once took for granted could become lifelines. Early mornings, I crept through dew-damp fields just as the sun began its climb, breathing in the crisp air and letting the quiet remind me that the world still turned, no matter how heavy my heart felt. I'd pause by the stream that cut through the meadow and watch the water ripple over smooth stones, thinking of how life, too, must find a way to keep flowing around the obstacles in its path. The first time I managed a half-smile was when I noticed a pair of swallows diving and dancing above the water's surface, fearless and free. Their simple joy felt like a whisper of hope carried on the breeze. At night, when the sky spilled stars overhead, I'd lie on the cool grass and let the vastness remind me that my troubles were part of something larger, something I had yet to understand. But not all nights were gentle. There were times when the emptiness pressed in so tightly that I would sit in the darkness and weep for the childhood I'd lost, for the mother who'd chosen her sorrow over her son, and for the man I feared I would never become. Anger bloomed alongside the grief, a hot, bitter root twisting through my chest, and I had to learn to let it out in small ways, pounding my fists against a tree trunk until the ache in my knuckles drew my mind back from the abyss, or screaming into the wind until my own echoes drowned out the doubt. Every scream felt like a small victory, a claim staked in the ground that said, "I am still here." As the weeks turned into months, I began to fill the empty spaces with new habits. I sketched the sloping horizon in the dirt with a stick, practicing until my shaky lines steadied into shapes I recognized: a cottage, a church bell tower, the curve of a mother's arm. In time, I learned to speak again, softly at first, greeting the chickens in the morning with a reluctant "good day," offering a nod to passers-by instead of averting my gaze. With each small act, I reclaimed a piece of my voice, and with it, a sliver of trust. My faith in myself returned in fragments, the knowledge that I could endure hardship beyond anything I'd imagined, the understanding that kindness could come from the most unexpected places, and the certainty that heartbreak, while it could break you, didn't have to define you. Life after the storm felt different, colder in some ways, yes, but also clearer. I saw the world's edges with sharper eyes, understood the fragility of joy, and held each moment of warmth more dearly. I'd lost a home, but I gained resilience. I'd lost a mother's embrace, but I found in my own heart an unyielding resolve to survive. And while the silence of those days was heavy, it also gave me space to hear my own thoughts for the first time, to learn that even in the deepest pockets of loss, you could find the seeds of renewal waiting to take root. Eventually, I stood up straighter, dusted straw from my trousers, and took the first step toward a future I hadn't dared to imagine, one built not on the promises others made, but on the quiet strength I discovered in the stillness after the storm. I can't rightly pin down the exact moment when the world began to shift under my feet, but I remember it felt like the first soft note of a new song after a long silence. It was early autumn, and the harvest moon hung low and heavy above the fields, casting everything in that gentle, forgiving glow. I was trudging back from the well, my bucket half empty, when I saw her, a frail old woman struggling with a broken wheelbarrow, its wheel stuck fast in the ruts of the dirt road. Normally, I'd have hurried past, head down, afraid of the pity in folks' eyes, but something in her posture reminded me of my own frailty, of how easy it is to get stuck when life seems determined to leave you behind. So I set my bucket down and offered a hand. She looked up at me, surprise flickering in her eyes, and in that moment, I felt a warmth spread through my chest, like dandelion seeds catching the breeze and floating free. Helping her didn't cost me much, just a little effort to pry the wheel loose and steady the handles, but it set something loose inside me, too. I realized I still had strength, I still had purpose, and that kindness, my mother's greatest lesson, wasn't something I'd lost to the barn or the betrayal or the long nights of emptiness. It was waiting for me, quiet as the moonlight, ready to guide me out of the shadows. From that day on, I carried a silent promise in my pocket. I would look for ways to be useful, to lend a hand, to plant small seeds of hope wherever I roamed. I began by tending the village garden, planting extra rows of carrots and radishes, and sharing the harvest with neighbors whose cupboards were as bare as my own used to be. The act of nurturing something green and living felt like a balm to my soul. Each sprout a reminder that life endures, even when the soil seems depleted. I learned to take joy in little victories, the first bright leaf unfurling at dawn, the soft pulse of life beneath the earth. Then I struck up a friendship with the schoolteacher's son, a curious boy with a crooked smile who reminded me of myself at his age, still full of wonder, still believing that anything was possible. I'd sit with him by the stream, telling him stories of far-off railroads and steam engines that roared like thunder, and in his wide-eyed astonishment, I found a spark of my childhood dreams rekindled. His laughter became a melody that chased away the ache of old grief, his questions a mirror reflecting my own thirst for meaning. Before I knew it, I was volunteering my afternoons to help at the little village school, teaching the children to read and write, drawing maps in the dirt, and showing them how to carve toy trains from scraps of wood. Each time I saw their faces light up with pride, I felt the heavy cloak of my past lift just a bit. It was in those moments, kneeling beside a child who couldn't pronounce a new word, guiding a trembling hand as it traced letters into the earth, that I began to understand what my mother meant when she spoke of kindness as life's greatest currency. It wasn't just a word to trade, it was the very thing that kept our world spinning. My heart softened, and I found myself laughing more easily, breathing more deeply, and waking each morning with a quiet anticipation of what the day might bring. I still remembered the pain, of course, how could I not? It was carved into me like the grain of old oak, but the pain no longer ruled me. Instead, it stood alongside me as a reminder of how far I'd come, how fragile and fierce a heart can be. And in place of fear, I discovered purpose. I realized that sometimes the second chance we need most doesn't arrive on wings of thunder. It comes on a whisper, a small gesture, a moment of connection that tells us we're not alone. That autumn, under the gentle gaze of the harvest moon, I found my new beginning not in grand triumph, but in the simple act of helping another soul find their footing. It was enough to set me on a path I'd never expected to walk, a path built on compassion, community, and the quiet confidence that even after the darkest nights, dawn will always find a way back to us. I sat on the edge of that rickety porch one evening, the same one where I'd first tasted freedom and fear so many years ago, and I felt the last stubborn knot in my chest finally begin to loosen. I'd carried that weight with me for more years than I cared to count: anger at my mother, shame for feeling betrayed, the ache of wondering if I was ever worth more than a bottle of vodka. But as the cicadas sang their gentle hymn beneath a sky painted burnt orange by the setting sun, something inside me shifted. I realized I could either stay chained to those old ghosts or stand up and choose life again. So I took a deep breath, felt the rough wood beneath my palms, and made a decision. I would let the past be a chapter in my story, not the whole book. I remembered how my mother used to whisper that kindness was life's strongest medicine, and I thought of the old woman with the broken wheelbarrow, the schoolteacher's boy, the swallows dancing above the stream, little beacons of light reminding me that goodness still existed in this world. And in that moment, I understood that forgiving wasn't condoning what was done to me, but freeing myself from the prison of anger and regret. I stood up slowly, the boards creaking under my weight, and I reached into the pocket of my overalls for the small, battered photograph I'd carried in my shirt since the day I left Ukraine. It showed me as a boy with braids in my hair, my mother's arm wrapped around me, her smile half hidden by a tear. For decades, I'd clung to that picture as proof of what I'd lost, but that evening, I held it tight and whispered, "Thank you for the love you gave me, however brief." Then, with a steady hand, I tucked it away in a drawer I seldom opened, deciding that the future I built here in Texas with my wife and grandchildren mattered more than the one I'd left behind. I reckon it was the hardest thing I've ever done, laying down that last piece of old pain and walking away without looking back. After that, I started each morning with a small ritual, pouring a cup of coffee, stepping onto the porch, and saying aloud, "Today I choose gratitude." It sounded almost silly at first, like talking to myself more than to anything real, but over time the words wove themselves into my bones, reminding me that every sunrise brought a fresh chance to live with purpose and joy. I even wrote a letter to my mother, though I never mailed it. I told her I hoped she found peace, that I forgave her, and that I no longer blamed her for her demons. Writing those words felt like exhaling decades of breath I didn't know I'd been holding. And though I folded that letter and tucked it into a book on my shelf, I felt the freedom of not having to carry its weight any longer. My life changed in ways both subtle and grand. I laughed more easily at family gatherings, my voice stronger when I shared stories of my youth, and my heart opened wider to the people around me. I no longer flinched at the mention of my childhood village. Instead, I spoke of it with gentle pride, grateful for the lessons it taught me. I began volunteering at the local train museum, showing curious visitors the old lantern I'd found as a boy scouring railroad yards, the same lantern that once lit my path toward a second chance. And every time a child's face lit up at the glow of that tiny flame, I felt a surge of wonder, as if I were 5 years old again, discovering hope for the very first time. I won't say the memories ever completely vanish, they're etched into my soul, but I carry them now as part of who I am, not as the definition of who I must be. I chose to live without bitterness, without letting old wounds dictate the shape of my days. I choose to live on, I say to myself, and to anyone who will listen, with my head held high and my heart open. That decision, simple as it sounds, was the true turning point, the final step that led me out of darkness and into a life filled with light, love, and the quiet conviction that, no matter where we come from, we always have the power to decide where we're headed next. You know, I've spent more nights than I can count staring up at a Texas sky far from that Ukrainian village, and in all that time I've come to understand something simple and true. Life doesn't owe you kindness, but you can still choose it for yourself. I remember the boy I was, the one who woke to the creak of barn boards instead of his mother's lullaby, who learned to swallow fear with his porridge and to hold each ache in his chest like a secret no one must ever know. He believed in magic then, magic in the laughter of children, in the curl of steam from a freshly baked loaf, in the promise that sunrise would rescue him from the night. But that boy's faith was tested by hunger, by betrayal, by the cold indifference of a world that spoke in clipped voices behind shuttered windows. He learned to hide his dreams in the furrowed lines of his forehead and to carry hope like a wounded bird in his hands, too afraid to let it fly away. Today, I'm an old man with wrinkles that map every trial I've faced, and I sit here on my porch, coffee in hand, grandchildren's laughter drifting on the breeze, and I see how far I've traveled. I see a life reborn from the ashes of my childhood, a life where forgiveness is not a favor to the one who wronged me, but a gift I give myself, where each act of kindness I offer is a reclamation of the goodness I feared lost forever. What I've learned, after all those years, is that our past shapes us but does not define us. It is the choices we make in the quiet spaces between our suffering and our triumph that carve out our true selves. You might carry wounds you didn't ask for, scars that sting when the world feels unforgiving, but you also carry the power to heal. Maybe you've been waiting for someone else to offer you that lifeline, someone else to show you the way back to trust, to joy, to a sense of belonging. Well, I'm here to tell you that lifeline starts with you. Kindness isn't a rare commodity reserved for the fortunate. It's a muscle in your heart that grows stronger each time you use it. Forgiveness isn't a surrender. It's an act of courage that frees you from the prison of bitterness. And hope isn't a childish fancy. It's a radical statement of faith that tomorrow can be kinder than today. So don't wait for apologies that may never come or for perfect circumstances to begin anew. Plant small seeds of goodwill in the soil of your days. Offer a smile to a stranger, lend your strength to a neighbor, speak gently to your own heart. Over time, you'll find those seeds sprout into a garden of resilience, a testament to the truth that even the smallest gestures can grow into forests of grace. My story began with a bottle of vodka and a child traded for a bargain, but it did not end there. It continued in the tender hands of strangers who helped me carry my bucket of water, in the warm voices of children learning to read under my crooked maps, in the quiet conviction that a man is more than the sum of his wounds. And so, friend, perhaps it's time you stopped waiting for life to be fair and started choosing to make it good. Because survival, I've learned, is not merely about enduring the storm. It's about learning to dance in the rain and to share your umbrella with those still caught in its downpour. That, to me, is the truest lesson of all. And here we are, at the end of a long road we walked together through memory and hardship, and I find myself looking straight at you across the years and the miles, wondering what you've taken from this tale. I want you to feel the warmth of this moment, The same warmth I feel sitting on that old rocking chair with the last rays of evening sun dancing on the porch boards. This isn't just a story about a boy traded away or a man who learned to stand again. It's a story about today, about each one of us who carries a past that sometimes weighs too heavy, and yet must find the strength to set it down so we can lift our faces to the light. Maybe you've known betrayal, or you carry wounds that still sting in quiet moments. Maybe you've held on to anger so long it's become a second skin. I want you to know that your story isn't finished either. The choices you make now, the small acts of kindness, the moments of letting go, those are the brushstrokes that paint the masterpiece of your life. I sometimes catch myself wondering if the ones who let us down ever remember the pieces they left behind. Sometimes I imagine my mother, somewhere in her own world of regrets, pausing on a familiar street and feeling a flicker of recognition, a whisper of something she once held dear. And in those moments I think to myself, maybe she does remember. But even if she doesn't, it doesn't erase the fact that I remember, and that remembrance shaped me into someone who could love fiercely, forgive deeply, and live fully. So, dear friend, as we close this chapter but know there are pages yet to write, I want you to ask yourself, what are you ready to release? What scar will you choose to turn into a story of survival, a beacon for someone else lost in the dark? And what small kindness will you offer today that might become another person's turning point? I leave you with this. Our past may have carved the lines on our faces and the calluses on our hearts, but it need not dictate the warmth we share or the light we carry forward. And what about you? Do you believe that true love, in all its forms, should always find its way back?